I pulled into my driveway at 2 in the morning after a 10-hour drive from Portland, ready to check on my bees and collapse into bed. The headlights swept across my property, and that's when I saw them. For people on my land at 2 a.m. They weren't supposed to be here because they thought I was still 300 m away at a conference. But there they were, dumping chemical containers near my hives, planting evidence like they'd rehearsed it. The HOA president, the same woman who had been threatening to shut me down for months, stood there coordinating the whole operation. She had no idea my Marine buddy had been doing routine checks while I was gone, or that he'd spotted their reconnaissance 2 days earlier. And she definitely didn't know he was parked 200 yards away right now, recording every single second of their little crime. By the time I pulled into my driveway at 2 a.m., I already knew something was wrong. Maddox's text from 6 hours earlier, "Call me when you get a signal, something's off," had been gnawing at me through the last 100 miles of Interstate 5. Now my headlights swept across my property and caught them. For people on my land dumping containers near my beehives, moving like they had every right to be there. The gate hung open, lock cut clean through. And standing in the middle of it all, directing the others with sharp hand gestures, was Claudette Ashford, the HOA president who'd been trying to force me out for months. Let me back up 12 hours because you need to understand why I was driving through the night instead of sleeping in a Portland hotel. The Pollinator Conservation Conference had wrapped up that afternoon. 3 days of presentations on native bee populations and ecosystem collapse. I'm a biologist 41 years old. Spent 15 years in academic research before I bought this 5-acre farm on the edge of Meadowbrook. The property came with a small wooden house space for 12 colonies and enough land to cultivate a wildflower meadow. I'd purchased it 7 years ago, 2 years before the HOA was even incorporated. That timing mattered because it meant they had zero legal authority over my land, and Claudette Ashford couldn't stand it. She'd shown up at my door 8 months ago with a binder of compliance requirements, architectural guidelines, and landscaping standards. I'd explained politely that I wasn't part of her association. She had escalated to the county, claiming my bees posed a public health hazard. I'd brought my credentials and 15 years of research data to that planning meeting. The county sided with me. She'd walked out with her jaw locked tight, and I knew she'd find another way. Maddox had warned me that day. He'd said she's the type who will create problems if she can't find them. I should have listened harder. Maddox Thorne and I met 2 years back at the county shooting range, both of us appreciating precision and order. He was 37, former Marine intelligence, now working security consultation. He lived 15 minutes away and had a professional's instinct for patterns that didn't fit. When I'd asked him to check on the hives during my conference trip, he'd agreed immediately, but his text that evening had carried an edge I recognized. Something's off. Not urgent enough to call, but enough to make him write it down. I'd glanced at the message during a gas stop around 6 p.m. and figured he was being cautious. Maddox saw threats in shadows, sometimes the kind of hypervigilance that comes with military training. But as I drove south through the fog, thick valley roads after midnight, that text kept surfacing in my mind. The conference had been good, solid data on pollinator corridors and native species adaptation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to be home. October was critical for the colonies. They needed adequate honey stores before winter, and I'd installed 2 new hives just before leaving. The responsible choice would have been a motel and a morning drive. Instead, I'd bought gas station coffee and pushed through something pulling me forward that I couldn't name. Instinct, maybe, or just exhaustion making me paranoid. The dirt road to my property was dark. No street lights this far from Meadowbrook's manicured center. I'd installed a camera at the front gate 6 months ago after Claudette had shown up unannounced to photograph my property lines, claiming I was encroaching on HOA easements. The footage had proven otherwise, but it had made me careful. Now, as my truck rounded the last bend, I killed the headlights and let the engine idle forward. The gate was open, not just unlocked. Cut open the chain link lock dangling from severed metal. Flashlight beams moved near the eastern fence line. 4 figures working in coordination. They were carrying containers, setting them down near the hives. One person filming with a phone while another arranged the materials. My pulse hammered against my ribs. Road fatigue burning away under a spike of adrenaline. Even in the darkness, I recognized Claudette's silhouette, the way she stood with her shoulders back like she was conducting a board meeting. She was directing them, pointing toward the colonies, gesturing at specific spots on the ground. This wasn't random vandalism. This was planned. I reached for my phone, but before I could dial, headlights blazed to life 200 yards behind me. Maddox's pickup truck engine rumbling low, high beams, cutting straight across my property and catching all 4 trespassers in harsh white light. They froze, heads snapping toward the sudden exposure. My phone buzzed, Maddox's voice coming through the speaker before I'd even unlocked the screen. He said, "Stay in your truck, Everett. I've got this recorded. Don't let them see you yet. Let them finish what they're doing." His tone was calm, controlled, the voice of someone who had been watching this unfold and knew exactly what he was seeing. Claudette was shouting now, her voice sharp and furious across the cold air. The other 3 people I couldn't identify in the shadows were scrambling, dropping whatever they had been holding. One of them, a man in a dark jacket, grabbed at the containers they had set down. Another was still filming, a phone camera pointed at the hives, like they were documenting evidence. Maddox's truck didn't move, just sat there with the lights burning, pinning them all in place. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, watching the scene unfold like a stage play under spotlights. He'd been here the whole time, watching, waiting, recording everything. The gut feeling that had pushed me through 10 hours of driving suddenly crystallized into certainty. This wasn't the first time they had been here, and Maddox had known they were coming. What I didn't know, sitting in my truck at 2 o'clock in the morning watching Claudette Ashford's operation fall apart under Maddox's headlights, was that this whole thing had been planned 6 hours earlier in the Meadowbrook HOA office. While I'd been driving south on Interstate 5, drinking bad coffee, and thinking about Bee Colony winter preparations, Claudette had been sitting in a conference room with 3 of her most loyal board members, mapping out exactly how to destroy me. Maddox would tell me about it later, after he'd pulled the security footage from the HOA building's parking lot cameras and cross-referenced the timeline. But right now, at this moment, I had no idea how deep this conspiracy went. The meeting had started at 6 p.m. right after the HOA's regular monthly session ended, and the other residents filtered out. Claudette had kept 4 people behind. Randall Driscoll, 48, the vice president, who handled all the association's media and documentation. Marlene Corbett, 56, the secretary who had been rubber stamping Claudette's decisions for 3 years. Vernon Hobbs, 42, the maintenance supervisor who had access to the HOA's equipment shed and supply vendors. And Claudette herself, 53 years old, sitting at the head of the table with a map of Meadowbrook spread out in front of her, my property marked with 3 red dots. Randall had pulled out his laptop, and Marlene had her notebook open, pen ready. Vernon sat with his arms crossed, looking uncomfortable but present. Claudette had started the meeting with a single sentence. She'd said, "We need to address the Everett Garrison problem permanently, and I need all of you committed to this solution." The room had gone quiet, the kind of silence that meant everyone knew they were crossing a line, but nobody wanted to be the first to object. Marlene had glanced at Randall. Randall had looked at Vernon, and Vernon had shifted in his chair, but nobody had stood up and walked out. Claudette had laid it out cleanly, her voice steady and reasonable, like she was proposing a new landscaping bot act instead of a criminal conspiracy. She had said Garrison's property was a non-compliant eyesore, that his refusal to join the HOA created a dangerous precedent, that his B operation posed unquantified risks to the community. She'd pulled out printed photos of my wildflower meadow, the wooden hive boxes, and the native plant garden I cultivated over 3 years. She'd called it visual pollution. She'd called it a safety hazard. She'd called it a property value drain, even though she had zero data to support that claim. And then she'd told them her plan. The strategy was simple, brutally so. They'd wait until I was out of town. She'd already confirmed I was at a conference in Portland through a mutual acquaintance. They'd enter my property after midnight when nobody would see them. They'd stage an environmental violation, something that would trigger county-level enforcement. Randall would document everything with video footage carefully edited to look like I'd been stockpiling hazardous materials. Vernon would supply the props: old pesticide containers and chemical waste from HOA storage materials that looked damning on camera. Marlene would create backdated complaint logs, fabricate a paper trail showing months of concerned resident reports, and Claudette would leverage her connection with a county environmental inspector, someone who owed her favors from previous zoning disputes, to fast-track an investigation. Randall had been the first to voice concern, but not about the ethics, just the logistics. He'd asked, "What if Garrison has cameras? What if someone sees us? What if this backfires?" Claudette had leaned forward, her hands flat on the table, and told him they'd go in at 1:30 a.m., that I'd be on the road until at least dawn, that the nearest neighbor was half a mile away, and wouldn't notice truck headlights on a Tuesday night. She'd said, "We're not vandalizing. We're documenting a pre-existing condition. We're doing community service by exposing a negligent property owner." The way she'd framed it, the way she'd made it sound almost noble, that's what had sealed the deal. Vernon had raised the trespassing issue, saying, "This is technically breaking and entering. We could face criminal charges if this goes wrong." Claudette had smiled the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and told him that her attorney had reviewed similar cases. She'd said, HOA boards have broad investigative powers when community safety is at stake, that they'd claim good faith concern about environmental contamination, that any prosecution would have to prove malicious intent. She'd made it sound airtight, legally defensible, a calculated risk with minimal exposure. Vernon had nodded slowly, still uncomfortable, but convinced enough not to leave. The assignments had been clear and specific. Randall would bring his drone and his phone, shoot footage from multiple angles, capture wide shots that made my 5-acre property look like an industrial dumping ground. Vernon would handle the physical staging, arrange the chemical containers near the beehives, create the appearance of long-term neglect and hazardous storage. Marlene would prepare the documentation: complaint forms with fake signatures, inspection notices with forged county letterhead, a timeline that suggested I'd been violating environmental codes for months. Claudette would make the official report to the county the next morning, backed by video evidence and a stack of falsified paperwork. It was systematic, coordinated, and completely illegal. Marlene had asked the question that should have stopped the whole operation. She'd said, "What if someone sees us? What about Garrison's marine friend, the one who has been checking on the property?" Claudette had actually laughed a short, dismissive sound. She'd said, "Max Thorne is all talk. He's a paranoid veteran who sees conspiracies everywhere. Nobody takes him seriously, and even if he notices something, he won't have proof." That line, that specific underestimation, was going to cost her everything. Because what Claudette didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Maddox had already spotted their reconnaissance. 2 days earlier, Maddox had been at my farm filling the bee feeders when he had noticed Claudette's car parked on the public road a/4 mile from my gate. She'd been sitting there with binoculars, studying my property layout, taking notes. He'd watched her for 20 minutes before she drove away, and his marine training had kicked in immediately. Reconnaissance meant planning. Planning meant action. So he'd gone home, pulled out his old surveillance equipment, and installed 2 wireless cameras and trees along my eastern fence line. He'd been monitoring the feeds every evening, watching for exactly this kind of move. The night before my return, Maddox had caught Vernon driving slowly past my gate, stopping to photograph the lock and fence line. Then, Randall's drone flying low over my hives, clearly mapping camera angles and sight lines. Maddox had texted me at 6 p.m. "Something's off." But he hadn't called because he didn't want to alarm me without concrete evidence. Instead, he decided to watch and wait, to let them commit fully before intervening. It was a tactical decision, the kind of patience that separates good surveillance from amateur mistakes. Let them believe they're safe. Let them incriminate themselves completely, then move. The HOA meeting had ended at 7:15 p.m., with handshakes and nervous smiles. Claudette had reminded them all 1:30 a.m. Meet at the North Service Road. Lights off in and out in 90 minutes. They'd agreed, committed, and walked out of that conference room thinking they were untouchable. Marlene had gone home to forge documents. Randall had charged his drone batteries and cleared his phone's memory for fresh footage. Vernon had loaded chemical containers into his truck, old pesticide jugs, and fertilizer bags with faded hazard labels. And Claudette had gone to bed confident, probably sleeping soundly, convinced that by Wednesday morning I'd be facing county enforcement and community outrage. What none of them had considered, what their arrogance had blinded them to, was that Maddox Thorne wasn't all talk. He was a Marine who understood operational planning, evidence collection, and the importance of documentation. While they had been congratulating themselves on their clever scheme, he'd been setting up a counter-operation. By the time they arrived at my property at 1:25 a.m., he'd already been in position for 2 hours. Night vision camera recording, audio equipment, active timestamp logs running. He'd watched them cut. My lock filmed them, dumping containers, recorded every word Claudette spoke into her walkie-talkie. And when I'd come driving up that dirt road 12 hours ahead of schedule, he'd been ready to turn their ambush into their destruction. Maddox had known something was coming 48 hours before it happened. That's the part most people don't understand about military intelligence training. You don't wait for the threat to materialize. You identify the pattern before it completes. 2 days before I drove back from Portland, he'd been at my farm doing his routine check, filling the sugar water feeders for the bees and inspecting the hive entrances for signs of stress. That's when he had spotted the HOA president's vehicle parked on the public access road A/4 mile from my gate, engine running, her silhouette visible through the windshield, holding binoculars. He'd watched her for 23 minutes, timing it precisely the way he'd timed enemy observation posts in Condor. She wasn't just looking. She was studying, taking notes on a clipboard, photographing my fence line with a telephoto lens. When she finally drove away, Maddox had walked the perimeter of my property, checking sight lines and angles, trying to see what she'd been measuring. The eastern fence had the clearest view of the beehives, the most direct access from the service road, and the least visibility from the main house. If someone wanted to do something without being seen, that's where they'd enter. He'd made a decision right there, standing in my wildflower meadow with the October sun dropping behind the hills. He was going to install additional surveillance. Maddox lived 15 minutes away in a small house he'd bought after leaving the Marines, a place with a workshop in the garage and enough land for a shooting range. He'd gone home that evening and pulled out equipment he hadn't used since his security consulting work. 2 wireless trail cameras with night vision motion sensors and 72-hour battery life. The cameras were designed for wildlife monitoring, but Maddox had modified them for tactical applications, upgraded lenses, encrypted transmission, timestamp accuracy down to the second. He'd returned to my property the next morning, told the bees he was borrowing some tree space, and mounted the cameras 20 feet up in 2 old oaks that bracketed the eastern fence line. The cameras went active at noon on Monday, feeding to an app on his phone and recording to a cloud backup he'd configured with military-grade encryption. He didn't tell me about them because he didn't want me to worry and didn't want me distracted during my conference presentations. If nothing happened, he'd remove them when I got back and we'd laugh about his paranoia over coffee. But if something did happen, he'd have evidence that would hold up in any court in the country. That's the difference between civilian security and military intelligence. You don't hope you're wrong. You prepare for being right. The first confirmation came Monday evening at 6:47 p.m. exactly when I was texting him from a gas station asking if the bees looked healthy. The motion sensor triggered on the south camera, catching the HOA maintenance supervisor's truck rolling past my gate at 5 miles per hour, slow enough to be deliberate. The driver stopped, leaned out of the window, and took 3 photographs of my lock and gate mechanism with his phone. Maddox zoomed the footage, confirmed the license plate, cross-referenced it with county records, and identified the vehicle as registered to the HOA's facilities department. That wasn't casual interest. That was operational planning. 2 hours later, the north camera picked up a drone flying at 80 feet, well below the legal minimum altitude for operation over private property without consent. The drone made 3 passes over my hives, hovering at different angles, clearly recording video footage. Maddox tracked the flight pattern, estimated the controller's position, and confirmed it matched the HOA vice president's typical parking spot on the service road. He screenshotted the drone's FA registration number from the Zoom footage, verified it belonged to the same individual, and added it to his evidence log. 2 reconnaissance passes in 3 hours meant they were moving fast, planning something for the immediate window while I was gone. That's when Maddox had sent me the text. "Call me when you get a signal something's off." He'd kept it vague because he didn't have enough yet to justify pulling me out of the conference, and didn't want to sound like he was overreacting to circumstantial observations. But he'd known the way. You know when a patrol route feels wrong, when the silence is too complete, when the pieces align into a picture you don't want to see. So he'd made his own preparations, loaded his surveillance kit into his truck, packed night vision equipment, audio recorders, and a thermos of coffee that would keep him alert through a long watch. Monday night, he'd parked his truck in a maintenance access point, 200 yards from my property, a spot with clear sight lines to my gate, but hidden from the main road by a stand of cottonwoods. He'd settled in at 10 p.m. running equipment checks, syncing his cameras, and starting a handwritten log with military precision. 2,200-hour surveillance initiated no activity. Weather clear, temperature 41 degrees. Every hour he had logged the status, maintaining the discipline that had kept him alive through 3 deployments. Most people can't sit still for 4 hours watching nothing happen. Maddox could sit still for 40. Nothing moved until 11:50 p.m. when the first vehicle appeared, a dark SUV that matched the vice president's registration lights off, rolling slowly past the service road intersection. The driver didn't stop, just continued on. But Maddox noted the pass, logged the time, and adjusted his camera angles. 12 minutes later, the same vehicle returned from the opposite direction, parked half a mile up the road, and went dark. Staging Maddox thought they're confirming the area is clear before committing. He'd seen the same pattern in pre-assault reconnaissance, the careful double check that separates professionals from amateurs. At 1:17 a.m., a second vehicle joined the first, a pickup truck that Maddox recognized as the maintenance supervisor's. Both vehicles sat idle for 8 minutes, long enough for a final briefing. long enough to distribute equipment and confirm roles. Then they moved, driving without headlights toward my property, parking in the shadows 70 yards from my gate. 4 people exited, 2 from each vehicle carrying bags and containers. Maddox activated his night vision camera, zoomed to maximum clarity, and started recording high-resolution footage. The HOA president was easy to identify, even in thermal imaging, her distinctive posture, and the way she directed the others with sharp hand movements. He watched them approach my gate, watched one of them pull out bolt cutters, and sever the lock with 2 clean cuts. I watched them push the gate open and step onto my property, moving with the confidence of people who believed they were completely unobserved. Maddox's training screamed at him to intervene immediately to stop the trespass before it escalated. But his tactical mind overruled the impulse. Let them commit, he thought. Let them plant whatever they're planting. Let them incriminate themselves so thoroughly that no lawyer can argue good intentions. Evidence isn't built on prevented crimes. It's built on documented ones. The 4 trespassers spread out near my beehives, unloading containers from their bags, old pesticide jugs with faded labels, chemical drums that looked industrial and hazardous. The vice president was filming everything with his phone, walking in circles to capture multiple angles, while the maintenance supervisor arranged the containers in deliberate patterns. The secretary was holding what looked like paperwork, photographing documents next to the stage materials, creating a false timeline. And the HOA president stood in the center talking into a walkie-talkie, coordinating the operation like a field commander. Maddox recorded every second, his camera capturing faces, voices, actions, and the damning context that this was planned, coordinated, and malicious. At 1:41 a.m., they started wrapping up, clearly working on it timid. And that's when Maddox made his decision. He'd given them enough rope. Now it was time to pull it tight. He started his truck, let the engine rumble to life, and flipped on his high beams, aiming them directly across my property to illuminate all 4 trespassers in harsh white light. They froze, caught like animals in a spotlight, and Maddox could see the panic ripple through the group. He called my phone knowing I was close, knowing I'd see what he was seeing. When I answered, he kept his voice calm and gave me the instructions that would preserve the evidence chain. Stay in your truck, Everett. I've got this recorded. Don't let them see you yet. Let them finish what they're doing. The HOA president was shouting now, her voice carrying across the cold October air, something about authority and community safety. The others were scrambling, grabbing at containers, trying to undo what they just staged, but it was too late, far too late. Maddox had 73 minutes of footage timestamped and backed up to 3 separate servers, showing every element of their conspiracy. He sat in his truck with the lights burning, watching them panic, and allowed himself a thin smile. They called him paranoid, dismissed him as a veteran who saw threats everywhere. Now they were going to learn exactly what a paranoid veteran with surveillance training could do when he was proven right. From my position in the truck, engine still running, I watched the 4 trespassers freeze under Maddox's spotlight like they'd been hit with a tactical flashbang. The HOA president recovered first, her voice cutting through the night air with that sharp authority she used in board meetings. But this time it carried an edge of panic. She was yelling something about community inspection rights, about HOA emergency protocols. Words that might have sounded official if she wasn't standing on my property at 1:43 in the morning with cut bolt cutters lying 10 feet from my severed gate lock. The other 3 were less composed. The vice president had dropped his phone. The maintenance supervisor was backing away from the chemical containers he just finished arranging, and the secretary stood frozen with papers clutched against her chest. Maddox's voice came through my phone speaker again, steady and controlled. He said, "Don't move yet. Everett, let me get this next part on record. They're about to make it worse. I kept my truck in neutral light, still off, watching from 100 feet away as the scene unfolded. The HOA president was walking toward Maddox's high beams, now her hand raised to shield her eyes, still trying to maintain some kind of authority. She called out asking who was there, demanding identification, saying this was a private HOA business. Maddox didn't respond, just sat in his truck with the engine rumbling and the lights burning, letting her words record themselves as evidence of her mindset. The vice president made the first critical mistake trying to retrieve the containers they'd staged. He bent down, grabbed 2 of the pesticide jugs, and started carrying them back toward the gate, clearly attempting to remove evidence. Maddox zoomed his camera, capturing the man's face, the containers, and the deliberate effort to undo what they'd done. That single action transformed this from trespassing into consciousness of guilt, from a possible misunderstanding into documented proof. They knew exactly what they were doing wrong. The maintenance supervisor was having a different crisis, standing next to the beehives with a shovel still in his hand, dirt on his boots from the holes he dug to bury some of the containers. He'd been creating the appearance of long-term contamination, making it look like I'd been illegally disposing of hazardous materials for months. Now, he was stuck, shovel in hand, fresh excavation visible even in the harsh light, his fingerprints literally all over the crime scene. The secretary was the one who broke first, her voice high and shaking as she called out to the HOA president. She said, "We need to leave. This isn't worth it. We need to go right now." But the president wasn't listening. She was still advancing toward Maddox's truck, still believing she could talk her way out of this. She got within 30 feet of Maddox's headlights before he finally spoke, his voice carrying across the property with that parade ground authority. He said, "Stop where you are. You're trespassing on private property. You've committed breaking and entering, and I have everything on video." That's when the president made her second critical mistake. Instead of stopping, instead of calling a lawyer, instead of exercising her right to remain silent, she started explaining. She said they were conducting an environmental investigation, that they've received complaints about hazardous material storage, that as HOA leadership, they had a duty to protect the community from negligent property owners. Every word she spoke was another nail in her legal coffin because Maddox was recording audio, and her explanation was establishing motive, demonstrating premeditation, and admitting to facts that no defense attorney would ever let her say in court. Maddox let her talk for 90 seconds. Let her lay out the whole justification, and then he cut her off with a single question. He asked, "Do you have a warrant? Do you have any legal authority to be on this property right now? Yes or no?" The silence that followed was absolute. The president's mouth opened, closed, opened again. She said something about HOA bylaws, about protective covenants. Maddox said, "That's not a warrant, you're trespassing, and you've staged evidence. I watched you dump those containers 15 minutes ago." The vice president dropped the jugs he'd been carrying, the plastic hitting the ground with a hollow thump. The secretary had her phone out now, probably trying to call someone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely unlock the screen. The maintenance supervisor finally set down his shovel and took 3 steps back from the hives. Like distance would somehow erase the holes he dug and the materials he planted. That's when I saw the final piece that made this go from trespassing to fraud. The secretary, in her panic, had dropped some of the papers she'd been holding, and they'd scattered across the ground near my largest hive box. Even from my truck, I could see they were official-looking documents, forms, with county letterhead inspection notices with signatures and dates. She'd brought forged paperwork ready to photograph it next to the staged contamination, creating a false timeline that would make it look like I'd been under investigation for weeks. Maddox saw it too, his camera automatically adjusting to capture the scattered documents. He said, "Through my phone, Everett, you see this? They brought fake inspection notices. This is a conspiracy to commit fraud. I gripped my steering wheel harder, watching the secretary scramble to collect the papers, trying to shove them back into a folder. Her movements frantic and sloppy. But Maddox wasn't done yet. He opened his truck door, stepped out into the headlight beams, and for the first time, the trespassers could see him clearly. 6'2" tall, military posture, holding a professional video camera with a telephoto lens. He said, "Nobody leaves until the sheriff arrives. You've committed multiple felonies, and if you try to drive away, I'll add fleeing the scene to the charges." The HOA president started to argue, started to say something about false imprisonment, but Maddox cut her off. He said, "I'm a witness to crimes in progress. I have every legal right to detain you until law enforcement arrives, and I'm calling them right now." He pulled out his phone with his free hand, keeping the camera trained on all four of them, and dialed 911. I heard him speak calm and professional, giving the dispatcher my address, describing for individuals engaged in criminal trespass evidence, tampering, and possible environmental crimes. The dispatcher asked if anyone was armed, and Maddox said no. Weapons were visible, suspects were contained, no immediate danger, but they were attempting to destroy evidence. The HOA president was yelling now, her composure completely shattered, saying this was harassment, that she'd have Maddox arrested for false detention. But her threats rang hollow against the reality of what Maddox had recorded, against the physical evidence scattered across my property, against the severed lock and the fresh holes and the chemical containers. Maddox told the dispatcher that deputies were en route, estimated arrival 12 minutes, and ended the call. He looked at me, then still sitting in my truck, and gave me a small nod. The message was clear. Stay put. Stay quiet.